All right, so finally, we're getting to the third piece of that worldview pie. If you remember at the beginning of the semester, unfortunately, I don't have my whiteboard here, so I can't do it, and I haven't learned how to use this program's whiteboard yet. It's kind of glitchy for me. Anyways, I'll do it visually. We have that circle of worldviews, and we've already talked about theism, and then pantheism, and today we're going to talk about naturalism materialism. And if you remember, a naturalist is someone who believes all phenomena, and by phenomena we mean anything you can perceive with the senses, all phenomena has a natural explanation. In other words, you don't have to posit a genie or a ghost or a god or a spirit to explain the old house creaking in the night, or weird noises or sounds, or any sort of phenomena. Everything can have a natural, physical, material explanation. That's what philosophic naturalism is. Very similar to it is philosophic materialism. I was thinking this morning about this lecture about Cyndi Lauper's we are living in a material world and I am a material girl. And it's funny because in our culture, we often use materialist as someone who's greedy or obsessed about physical possessions. Now, that could come out of a philosophic materialist worldview, but philosophic materialism is simply stating there is only matter. There is only the natural. There is no supernatural. So, for example, materialists would say we have a body, we do not have a soul. We have a brain, we do not have a mind. Does that make sense? So those non-tangible parts that both pantheists and theists believe we have, the naturalist materialists would say, no, those are just kind of shadows because we have physicality, but reality is physicality. That is the naturalist materialist point of view. No gods, no angels, no heavens, no hell. It's just matter. And like the early Greeks, where we started this class, the monistic materialist, and then later the pluralist, we've kind of come full circle now with modern science returning kind of back to these ancient Greek roots. What I've chosen for you today comes from a Darwin Legacy conference that was put on by Stanford University in California, and I believe this was 2009. We could double check, but it was the 150-year anniversary of Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species and the Preservation of Preferred Races. Now, his use of races there is referring more to species. In The Descent of Man, he gets more into like human races, and very interesting, very different books. And we're going to talk more about that on the last lecture I show you. I'm going to show you two from this series. So what I'm going to do today, we have Dr. Eugenie Scott coming in, and she works for the National Academy of Science as a lawyer. And what they would do is, say you're teaching science in some little rural Alabama school, and all the locals are creationists, and you're trying to teach Darwinian evolution, and you get drawn before the school board or threatened to be fired. Well, Eugenie Scott and her legal team would come in and support you to defend your right to teach science in a science classroom and not have to worry about the particular religious sensibilities of the community you happen to be living in. And so she's very good at what she does, and her talk is about science and religion. And can they go together? How do we navigate that in a country like America? And so I think she does a really good job of talking about the difference between like what science is. And then I think it's very important to also, she rolls out the scientific method. And so those are the two big takeaways I want you to get from this. And questions I want you to think about are, can we use science for the study of origins? All right. So hold that thought, and I'll type that in the bar. But can we use science to study origins? So I hope you enjoy this lecture. I think Eugenie Scott is quite witty, kind of a dry humor, but I'm going to be talking over it and pausing it, and hopefully it won't be too annoying to you. Enjoy.
Such a difficult subject is someone we should listen to and learn from. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eugenie Scott.
Drive-by science is what I do. I'm here for an hour. I'm going to say some things, then I'm going to disappear. And your faculty members have to mop up afterwards. So it's kind of a good deal for me, I guess, when you come right down to it. Science and religion. Probably not quite what you think it is, because people have a lot of confusion about what science is, and they really have a lot of confusions about what religion is. I'm going to start off by talking about epistemology. See, I can use big words with Stanford students, can't I? Ways of knowing. And any philosopher of science in the audience start cringing now, because what I'm going to do is simplify to a most disreputable extent. But that's what I have to do. I'm going to collapse a whole semester's work of discussion about ways of knowing into basically 3. And obviously there's a Procrustean bed going on here. One way of knowing is science. And since I'm going to be talking about that most, I'm going to talk about the other and come back to science. Another way of knowing is reference to personal states of being or insight. One of the most familiar examples of this way of knowing is a drug-induced state, which obviously none of you would know anything about whatsoever, but which sometimes tribal populations will engage in. The Yanomamo Indians in Venezuela will take hallucinogenic snuff, and the spirits from the forest will inhabit them, and they'll receive knowledge from the spirits about hunting or about the next tribe over whom they are at warfare with or whatever. Drug-induced states, a vision quest of a Plains Indian individual back in the 1800s, 1700s, where they would put themselves through conditions of great privation to basically generate hallucinations. And at that point, the gods of the Crow or the Sioux would then inhabit them and give them messages. They'd learn what their personal totem was and so forth and so on. And these kinds of personal insight or ways of knowing, ways of getting information based upon your individual experience can be extremely powerful to the individual. But they're not very persuasive to people either not from your culture or somebody from your culture who hasn't had that experience. I'm sure that the experience of a Yanomamo Indian of being filled with the forest spirits is going to be very unpersuasive to a fundamentalist Christian. But the experience of a fundamentalist Christian of being filled with the Spirit of God and therefore gaining insight into a variety of things is not going to be very persuasive either to the Yanomamo Indian or even to a Catholic whose tradition does not include those kinds of experiences. So this way of knowing tends.
Okay, so Eugenie Scott's off to a great start. I like her little diagram of epistemology. Fortunately, you guys know what epistemology is now because of our little tour of philosophy. But epistemology, as you remember, is theories of knowing. But the first question, of course, is, can we know anything? And don't forget the importance of those discussions we had about the difference between knowing and believing. Okay? And science is not about believing stuff. You generally will not hear a scientist say, well, I believe, or I hope, or I desire. The idea is we're data-driven decisions where you look at the data, you look at the facts, and then you begin to create hypotheses. And she's going to roll that out in the scientific method later, so I don't want to steal her thunder. But she's saving science for last, but you can already see the problem with this sort of religious experience or personal experience way of knowing. And she's not saying those experiences aren't true, but she's saying those experiences are not compelling to other people who do not have them. So I can run around and say, God loves you and Jesus is living in my heart and he made this one best of all possible worlds. But for someone else who has not had that personal experience, that could be very unconvincing, to put it mildly. In fact, they may think you have a mental problem. So back to you, Jeannie.
To be very idiosyncratic and not very persuasive to other people. Another way of knowing is authority. And, you know,
obey.
We live in the Bay Area, right? So we see all the question authority signs, right? And I always want to get out a magic marker whenever I see one of those bumper stickers and, you know, question authority, but stop at stop signs. There's authority kind of takes a bad rap in the Bay Area, but, you know, authority isn't all that bad. And your first authority, obviously, is your parents. Those of you sitting in the back of the room who are the undergraduates, I understand, are moving away from that right now, but it is always true that your parents are right. Just remember that. And you can sort of see why it would be adaptive, really, for kind of instant obedience for a parent for a very young child. When mom says, get out of the street, here comes the car, that's not greatly different from a Pleistocene mom saying, don't tease the saber-tooth. There's definitely adaptive value to following what mom says to do. And most of the things that we know, we do take on authority by and large, even many things that we know through science. When Steve Weinberg talks about quarks, I accept his authority. But it's not quite the same thing as mom's authority in telling you not to run into the street or something. I know that if I really wanted to, I could spend years and years studying the mathematics and understand why Steve Weinberg, the Nobel laureate, says what he says about quarks. I'm disinclined to do that, though, because my palms sweat at the thought of a fraction. So I tend not to, want to demonstrate to myself that what Weinberg says about quarks is correct. But I know that I can talk to other physicists who have spent the time, and so I know that there's a way of verifying the statements made in science. So it's not quite the same sort of authoritarianism as what we usually consider in this particular way of knowing of authority. I want to call your attention to one particular kind of authority, which is revelation. Revelation is authority that is revealed to the person, member of the culture, from a sacred source.
Here we go.
And many, many religions receive knowledge through authorities. The oracle at Delphi received, the Delphic oracle received messages from Apollo and gave them to the people who came to find out what they should do about things. The Muslims believe that the Quran was inspired, that Muhammad was inspired by God to write the Quran. Christians believe that the Bible, and especially the New Testament, was inspired by God directly to the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the other people who set down these stories. Again, Revelation tends to be fairly culture bound. What is a acceptable revelation from a sacred source to one individual is not necessarily acceptable to another. Modern day conservative Christians are not going to accept the Delphic oracle.
Good point, Eugenie. Now think about this, and if you want to test if what she's saying is true, because who knows, you may have had some incredible life-changing mystical experience with God, right? You felt that spirit of God come upon you, or you heard God's still small voice, or maybe you were reading in the scriptures and the Holy Spirit illumined your soul and gave you new life. But you understand how crazy that sounds to people who have not had those experiences. And if you want to know how crazy it sounds, just think about people you know, either directly or that you've heard their accounts from other perspectives. For example, let me just start close and we'll move out. If you come from a cessation Christian background, and what I mean by that, you believe that some of the gifts have ceased, like speaking in tongues, maybe certain supernatural healings. And then you have more charismatic Pentecostal friends who are telling you all about their speaking in the tongues of angels and how they went to the park and helped people's legs grow, or someone had their cancer removed after laying on of hands. That is obviously not going to be very convincing to a cessationist crowd, right? They're going to want data. They're going to want documentation. They're going to want to make sure this isn't some charlatan. And that's just within the Christian community. Can you imagine if some Hindu or some Buddhist or some Muslim starts telling you about their mystical encounters with Brahman or Allah or Vishnu or something of that nature? It's probably not going to be very convincing. Or if you're visiting the Hopi Indians and they're talking to you about the Kachina spirits and how the clans dance together, if you're not from that culture, it's probably just going to sound bizarre and weird, and you might be polite and deferential, but it's probably not going to be very intellectually convincing for you.
As a source of knowledge by revelation, nor are they likely to accept Mohammed as a source of revealed truth.
This is why you can't just quote the Bible at people.
Well. So the problem with
has no authority for them.
States of knowledge or insight or authoritarian ways of knowing is that they tend not to be persuasive to others. I want to talk now about science, because science is, and I'm tossing logic in here, and yes, logic is really separate from science, but science uses logic, and I'm simplifying, so that's, think logic as well as science.
Fair enough.
Let me talk a little bit about what science is. Now, you may be kind of surprised to hear me describe science as a limited way of knowing. But science is a limited way of knowing in two ways. It's limited because all we're trying to explain is the natural world. That's one limitation. The second limitation, in my view, is that we are limited to using natural processes or mechanisms.
Okay, I'm going to let you guys in on a little secret. And I hope this is okay with the YouTube guidelines. I'm not sure about playing a video and critiquing over the top of it, but I'm hopefully doing this academically and respectfully. And I can post the whole thing, a link, so if you guys want to see Dr. Scott. But this is something I want you guys to be aware of. He or she, in this case, who defines the terms, wins the argument. And if you look at her definition of science, it is almost verbatim the definition I gave you for naturalism. Philosophic naturalism. Fascinating. Science is limited to explaining the natural world using natural processes. Naturalism is all phenomena can be explained through natural processes. In other words, anything you can see, taste, touch, smell, feel, even things like love can be explained in terms of natural chemical processes taking place in the body, right? Your body's putting out those endorphins and the serotonin and the oxytocin, and you're just like, oh, I'm in love, give me that good feeling. But for a naturalist materialist, it's not some non-tangible thing. It is physical. It's a physical biochemical reaction that's taking place, even something as precious as love. All right. So science is limited to explaining the natural world using natural processes. Those that define the terms win the argument. If Eugenie Scott and the National Academy of Science get the court to accept this definition of science, then they've already won their case before it's begun, because by definition, creationists are not doing science. And why is that? I'd love to have some dialogue with you. What is the problem with creationism that is not following this definition that Eugenie Scott just rolled out? Anybody? You can type it in or talk to me.
You said, what is the problem with creationism?
Yeah. Why? For example, San Diego Christian College, back when it was Christian Heritage College, what kind of birthed this Institute of Creation Research. And it's very similar to like Answers in Genesis. But part of the problem was people were saying that's pseudoscience. And if you go to Wikipedia or other places and you look up creation science, they have it labeled not even as an actual science, but as a pseudoscience. Why would that be? And it all has to do with this definition right there.
Maybe because there's not enough concrete evidence for it, or not everybody believes in it.
Okay, that's part of it, but see, this is the thing, and I go on a lot of creation evolutionist chat rooms, and I hear their debates, and one of the major things I hear a naturalist materialist call creationist on is, show us your evidence, show us your data. We have mounds of evidence and data proving or pointing to Darwinian evolution. And what my retort would be is, it's not like there's one pile of creation evidence and another pile of evolutionary or naturalistic evidence. It's the same stinking pile of evidence. What's different is the people looking at that evidence have colored lenses. Some are seeing it through their God goggles or their kaleidoscope pantheist goggles, and others are seeing it through their naturalist materialist goggles. If you accept this definition, by definition, if you say God created, you're not doing science anymore, because you have introduced the supernatural as an explanation for events in the material world. And so this is a brilliant move. What I would challenge you is look up the definition of science in dictionaries. And I'm talking about old dictionaries. Start going back like into the 1800s, even into the 17th century. And if you remember, this is another caveat of, in those rooms, I often hear like, what has religion contributed to the world or society besides wars and prejudice and misogyny? Look what science given us: vaccines, more efficient ways to travel, longer lives, more comfort, less intensive manual labor, all these sorts of bennies science has given us. But once again, my retort is, where do you think modern Western science came from? It came out of atheistic traditions of Europe. And some of the early, in fact, the founder of the modern scientific method, Francis Bacon, viewed himself as a theist. Now, I wouldn't go so far to equate him to like a modern evangelical or born again or any of that, but he certainly was in that worldview piece of theism. And Sir Isaac Newton, all these guys were growing up living and even using theistic terms. So a 17th century view of science would be much more akin to science is the art of observing and thinking about the works of God. Very different from it's about the natural world and explaining it with natural processes. Okay, so watch the definitions. Don't give people definitions unless you want to give them the argument.
That gives us a lot to do, because there's a lot in the natural world that we can attempt to explain, and we have a great deal to learn about the processes and history of the planet and so forth. But still, that leaves out a lot of things that human beings might be interested in knowing more about. The important component of science, in my opinion, is that a scientific way of knowing, a scientific explanation, is one that tests itself against the natural world. The big idea in science is really testing of knowledge. Let's talk a little bit about testing, because when people think of tests, they think of experiments, right? And I tend not to use the word experiment. Aren't these awful pictures? Because when you use the word experiment, this is the kind of image that people get. Somebody sitting in the laboratory pouring something from one beaker to another. I like to use the word testing. An experiment, a direct experiment like these people are doing in the picture, that's one kind of test, but there's a lot of different ways of testing an explanation. These archaeologists can be testing their explanations in a field setting.
Okay, just very quickly, this is a great point Dr. Scott's making about, and I will grant her this. This is part of where the epistemology, scientific sort of epistemology, that empirical way of knowing, what you can see, taste, touch, smell, feel, hear, what you can weigh, what you can measure, what you can test. And why this is wonderful is you see the problem with the Yanomamo Indian or the fundamentalist Christian, and they're both making these truth claims, but unless you take that hallucinogenic drug, or unless you have that encounter with the Holy Spirit, or unless you're living at the time of the Delphic Oracle and can get those entrails read, unless you're in those places and in that worldview and that belief system, what the Delphic Oracle says, or the Yanomamo, or the fundamentalist Christian, is not going to be compelling. But with science, it doesn't matter if you're an animist, a pantheist, a theist, or a naturalist. You could be a Christian, Buddhist, shaman, whatever. You can all look at the same empirical data, the same physical, tangible thing, and you can do tests on it where you don't need an angel whispering in your ear, or you don't have to ingest some hallucinogenic root to understand what you're looking at. But you can explore it, you can investigate it, you can set up hypotheses and test. And so she's going to roll out the scientific method. And well, let me do that real quick, because I don't think she lays it out as neatly as I do. Okay, so with the scientific method, now science is the explanation of the natural world through natural processes. The scientific method is you observe the natural world, then you create a hypothesis, which is like a good or educated guess. You're looking at something that's happening and you're trying to figure out, why is this taking place? And you come up with different hypotheses. Then you test that hypothesis. And she's going to go into detail about controlled testing and blind testing, so I'll let her do that. But after you do the testing, if the tests confirm your hypothesis, then you can strengthen it into a theory. If, however, the testing disproves your hypothesis, you go back and you create a new hypothesis with the data you had gathered, and then you retest that. If that now is verified, you can strengthen it to a theory. If once again your hypothesis is refuted by the testing or the data, you go back and you create a new hypothesis. So science isn't making these absolute truth claims like you might find in Christianity or Hinduism, but it's saying this is what we know so far based on our understanding. But science is always trying to take in new understanding, and they're going to adjust their theories accordingly. Now you go to the theory and you test it just like you did the hypothesis. If you can 100% verify that this takes place every time, you have what we call a law. And there's precious few laws in science, as you can well imagine. There's a lot of very strong theories, but a theory is not the same as a law. Now, Eugenie, that's one of her pet peeves. She's going to go off and say, yeah, gravity is a theory, but there's not many people who are just going to jump off a building because it's just a theory, right? It's a very strong theory, and we have very strong and good reasons to believe in gravity, or the phenomena of gravity. And so whether you're a Yanomamo Indian, a Christian, or an atheist, we can all look at and not look at, but we can test these theories about gravity. Two laws of science, and let me be clear though, they're called laws, like the first and second laws of thermodynamics. The first being the law of conservation of energy, where energy can't be created or destroyed. It simply can be disseminated or concentrated. That's the first law. And the second is entropy, this idea that in a closed system, things go from a place of order to disorder. Anyways, Those aren't even laws, though. Those are strong theories, because we don't know if the same thing is going to happen tomorrow as it's happening today, or if at some point the universe will keep expanding where energy keeps being dissipated like an entropy. But what if the law of eternal recurrence is true and everything at some point comes back to the big crunch again before it explodes up? Well, that's going to change the law of entropy, right? So we don't know, but they're strong theories. Now back to my question. Can we use science to study origins? Can we use the scientific method to study origins? Observation,
No.
hypothesis, testing, theory, testing, law. All right. So we had a quick answer there. I think that was Vanessa, or I'm not sure who that was, but I'm going to let Eugenie Scott talk some more, and then I'm going to come back to that question for you.
These biologists sitting in a blind making observations of ducks can be testing a hypothesis. You don't have to control all of the variables. You don't have to do your testing in a laboratory to still be testing an explanation. When we're talking about testing explanations, we're talking about holding constant certain variables and looking at what's left so that you can see whether your explanation really does explain what it is you're trying to explain. Most Americans don't understand that. It's kind of sad. Let me give you an example.
It is sad.
Every 2 years, the National Research Board publishes a booklet called Science and Engineering Indicators. And they ask, it's a bunch of statistics about science and engineering. And there's also a chapter, it's the only one I ever read, about understanding of science. What is the American understanding of various scientific concepts, and also understanding of science as a way of knowing, of the methodology of science. And unfortunately, only about a third of Americans get the nature of science right. The correct answer is that science has to do with the testing of explanations or systematic comparison or experimentation. People often understand a concept but yet can't exactly recall a definition. So the good folks at the National Research Board have tried to help folks out by giving them an example. And here's the example. It has to do with testing a blood pressure medicine. And you have a blood pressure medicine, you want to know if it's efficacious. One way of testing it would be to give the drug to 1,000 people and then measure how many have decreased blood pressure. A second way, give the drug to 500 people with high blood pressure, don't give the drug to another 500 people with high blood pressure, and then measure to see how many have lower blood pressure. Okay, boys and girls, how many of you think that statement number 1 is a good scientific test? Oh, you're cautious, aren't you? How many think that statement number 2 is a better way of testing it? Well, congratulations, because you did better than 43% of your fellow citizens. Each of whom I will call to your attention has 1 vote, just like you, but that's another issue. Yeah, we don't really understand the idea of testing. Let's talk a little bit about testing, because, like I say, Americans don't really have the idea of testing explanations. To me, one of the most important components of science is being able to ask, is there another explanation? Let's say that you have a friend who is a dowser. He claims that he can find water using a forked stick. He's holding his dowsing rod there. He claims that there are mystical forces that come from the water up through the dowsing rod, which he can feel, and therefore he can find water. A lot of people think that you can find water using a forked stick, or maybe some people can find water. Do you think this man will find water? Is there another explanation? In fact, I think he's about to fall into a puddle before he... There may be many reasons why old Uncle Fred on the next hollow over is able to find water.
That's right.
Maybe he's lived in this valley for a long time, and he kind of subliminally knows where water is likely to be found. It may be that he lives in a place like these English dowsers where wherever you dig, you're going to find water. That's a wonderful picture because it's after a rain, but they're out there just very enthusiastically. If any of you are teachers or are thinking of becoming teachers, you can have a wonderful lesson with your students using something like dowsing and actually testing whether or not dowsing works. And if this was an actual class, I would go through this with you. In the meantime, there's a wonderful site from the Australian skeptics, which I will call to your attention, where all of this is described, and it's really a lot of fun. This is the Australian Dowsing Association. These are all people who are convinced that they can find water with a forked stick. And so the Australian skeptics set up a test. They took these plastic bottles, which I believe is there, one is there, right there. And some of these plastic bottles had water and some of them did not have water, and the plastic bottles were covered up, and the dowsers would go around and see, whether they could detect which of these covered plastic bottles had water and which did not. The tendency is to count the hits and forget the misses, so that's why you have to do this in an organized fashion, controlling for certain variables. If you were a class of mine, I would lead you to understanding the principle of blinding, which is that the dowsers can't know in advance which bottles have the water. You'd be surprised how useful that is when you're setting up a test. And then I would lead the students to understand about double blinding.
Yes.
And that is that the guy with the check sheet who is writing down whether or not dowser A or dowser B selects the proper, or what I should say, not proper one, whether the dowsers select or don't select a particular bottle, that person also can't know where the bottles are. Can you think why that would be so? Yeah, you could inadvertently cue. You're getting close. Sixth graders are wonderful to do this with because they totally cue in the investigators, and that's how you teach them about double blinding. At any rate, there's all kinds of things that you would want to do to make this a fair test. The idea is controlling variables. You want to have not just the water bottles, watered and unwatered, because the bottles with water are going to sink deeper into the grass, so you have to put something in the other bottles as well that's of equal weight. You can brainstorm about all the things you'd have to control to make this a really good study. And then, of course, in double blinding. And of course, when you do that, you find that the dowsers don't find water any more frequently than expected by chance, which is a fun thing. So testing is a very, very important component of science. In addition to testing, another very important part of science is inference. And I want to talk about inference because people kind of look at inference as if it's a lower form of science, so to speak. Ken Ham, the Australian actually, who runs Answers in Genesis, an important creationist ministry in northern Kentucky, has a mantra that he teaches students to say to their teachers, "Were you there?" The idea being that unless you are directly observing something, well, you're just making an inference, and inferences are a lower form of science. Actually, all really good science is done through inference, and we use inference all the time. Let us take an example. Here's a picture. This picture shows a number of things. It shows a highway, it shows a highway department stripe, it shows...
Okay, before Jeannie goes on to her wonderful cow pie in the road explanation, to explain the difference between observation and inference. I know a lot of you have taken Bible classes or studied hermeneutics, the art of interpretation. And this in a literary theological context would be the difference between exegesis and eisegesis. So exegesis, this is where you take from what's there, you extract X, you remove it, exegesis. And this would be like deduction, where you're observing natural phenomena and you're coming to questions or hypotheses based on what you've observed. Okay. Now, sometimes we come upon something, some event, some scene, like a cow pie sitting in the road, and we didn't actually see the cow leave that pie in the road, or the highwayman, Caltrans put the stripe down, or the road workers laying down the asphalt. But because of our past experiences and because of our worldview, we have certain presupposition ideas of how something like that could take place. But that is an inference. That is not the scientific method. Okay, one more time. If you can't observe it, you can no longer do the scientific method and testing. Now, you can still use science, but now you have to use inference. And what Eugenie Scott is doing now, she is pivoting to show the importance of inferences. But inferences have not been demonstrated through testing. Any questions on that distinction between inference and the scientific method? Okay. You can think about it. I'm going to let her roll out this example, and we'll come back to it. Watch for the bait and switch is what I call it.
It shows a cow pie. It shows the tire track. Now, let me break this down for you a little bit because it's kind of hard to see in that picture. There's the road. There's the cow pie. There's the highway department stripe. There's more cow pie. And then there's a tire track on top of the cow pie. Now, were you there? Well, no. We weren't there to see this event happen that produced this particular interesting layering. But we can use logical inference. We can use observations and logical inference from those observations.
By the way, please don't say that to people. I'll never forget the Bill Nye Ken Ham debate about should creation science be taught in schools. And Bill Nye was taking like the National Academy of Science view and saying, no, creation science is fine to teach in cultural studies or a Christianity class or a comparative religion class, but it shouldn't be taught in a science class because we're trying to look at things that aren't dependent on revelation or the supernatural, that all students can come together, they can observe events, and then come up with theories. Okay, so this is part of what's going on in this context. And I'm actually going to let Eugenie continue some more, and I'll get back on it. Sorry. I need to stop interrupting her.
To come up with a pretty reasonable explanation for how this sequence of items got to be there in this particular order. Now, you might hypothesize, well, first of all,
I'm sorry, I distracted myself, but back to the Bill Nye Ken Ham debate. In the middle of this debate, Ken Ham rolls out the "Were you there?" And Bill Nye, it was great. He said no, but he just flipped it right back on Ken Ham, and he was basically like, you could say the same argument. Why do you believe in the Bible? And he would say, well, because it was given to us by revelation from God to prophets of old who wrote down what God told them. And all you have to do is say, were you there? Did you see Paul dictating his epistles? I mean, you're taking that purely on faith. So it's a double-edged sword, right? If you want to start throwing out the were you there argument, Ken Ham's response was quite fun, though. He said, well, no, I wasn't there, but I know someone who was. And he, of course, is referring to God. But see, speak of not doing science now, at least according to Eugenie Scott's definition, is you're depending on your belief about the origins of the world based on some supernatural being that you can't see or tangibly connect with. And he supposedly is putting this knowledge into the heads of men who are then writing it down, and we're supposed to believe that. And for Eugenie Scott, or those who aren't in faith, or those who don't believe in the authority of the Bible, that is not any more compelling an argument than the Oracle of Delphi. Now, I'm sure some creation scientists would argue differently, but we can pick that up again later. So don't say, "Were you there?" It's obnoxious, and it could be flipped right back on you.
First of all, how many of you think the tire track came first? That's the beginning of inference, right?
Yes.
Obviously, the road came first, because that's on the bottom. This is the same principle that geologists use when they're interpreting something like the Tapeats Formation in Grand Canyon. In geology, there's a principle called superposition, which is the stuff on the bottom is older than the stuff on top.
Yes.
That is an inference. Nobody would dare to observe the Tapeats sandstone being laid down. But you can make a very logical inference about which are the strata and the younger strata, unless you have some very good reasons not to. So you would come up with, I think, a fairly reasonable explanation. Now, in science, you always want to ask, is there another explanation? Well, possibly, yes. Well, maybe an astronaut from outer space came in. Maybe an extraterrestrial came in and arranged the cow pie and the stripes and the tire track as we see them. Well, that's possible. I mean, after all, maybe not Marvin the Martian, but an extraterrestrial would at least be a material cause, right? This is a if extraterrestrials exist, then they are creatures of matter and energy. And if an extraterrestrial came down to produce this sequence, then we might assume that there'd be some evidence of this. And there is no evidence of this, and it's much less likely that an astronaut came in to make this display than you just had a really lazy highway department who, when they came and striped the road, didn't bother scraping off the cow pie, but just striped right on over it and proceeded on down the road. Another equally reasonable hypothesis would be it was an inobservant highway striping car, but either lazy or inobservant, much more likely than an extraterrestrial who came from a civilization we don't even know about, very, very far away with technology that we can't dream of, very unlikely. What about Thor? Maybe Thor came in and built the sequence. Well, you know, we can't test that, because the nice thing about being a god is that you are all powerful. And Thor could have come in and arranged the cow pie and the stripes exactly like we see them and leave no evidence whatsoever, because gods, of course, are immortal and omnipotent, and they wouldn't have to leave the tracks of the spaceship, for example, like a material producer would. So we don't use supernatural explanations in science. We don't use supernatural explanations because there's no way that we can hold constant a supernatural power. And if science is about testing and holding constant variables, we have to just leave supernatural explanations like Thor out.
Okay. I like how Dr. Scott's doing this. She obviously isn't talking about Thor, right? She's kind of subtly making a point about the theistic piece of the pie we're talking about. And this becomes that power of inference. Your inferences are going to be lodged in your worldview. So if you presuppose that there is nothing supernatural in the cosmos, your inferences are going to be naturally based, materially based. If, on the other hand, your worldview believes in the supernatural, and that's part of reality for you, your inferences could have legitimate supernatural backing of why things are taking place. So this is the power of the worldview piece. Now, in Christian evidentialist apologetics, they are going to try to use just just like a natural materialist, they're going to try to show through data, through the fossil records, through genetics, through morphology, through decay, through radiation, through carbon-14. They're going to try to use all these things to try to demonstrate that there is a God, that the scriptures are authoritative and true. But how are you going to use evidence to demonstrate a supernatural? How are you going to use the physical to demonstrate the non-physical? And so this becomes a real problem where you have kind of like these data offs. And like I'm saying, you can have like Archaeopteryx, the feathered bird, lizard bird, right, with teeth and scales and a long jointed tail. And the creationist is just going to look at that as like an early bird created by God. And a Darwinian evolutionist is going to see that as one snapshot in a long progression from a single-celled organism to modern birds. And they're looking at the same fossil, but their inferences are squarely lodged in their worldview. And this is why I think a class like this is important. I think scientific models of origins is interesting too, where you kind of have a data off or an interpretation of the data. This, we're having a worldview off, a presupposition off is what's happening. And this is where I think the debate of origin should be taking place. Better keep moving.
So inference is a very basic way that we make decisions. And this is a very simple inference, obviously, but we make inferences about things all the time. Evolution is an inference. Evolution is the inference that living things have descended with modification from common ancestors.
What?
And we make this inference based upon a huge range of information, including the fact that living creatures form this hierarchical distribution. Bears and dogs look more like each other than they look like lions, because bears and dogs shared a common ancestor with each other more recently than they shared a common ancestor with lions. Okay? This is the way the tree of life falls out in this hierarchical fashion. Evolution generates hierarchy. The only explanation that makes sense of this kind of distribution of similarities and differences is common ancestry. But it's an inference, it's not an observation.
And there's the cat's out of the bag as far as I'm concerned. And I do appreciate this, but she's going to do what I call a bait and switch coming right up. So she just acknowledges that the theory of evolution is inference because we're not observing it happen, certainly not at the level of one species becoming another. We've seen speciation certainly take place, but we haven't seen things leave different families. And once again, this hierarchy she's pointing out, this is a human matrix superimposed upon the natural material world. Are there other matrices we could use that involve a god? Well, what about the great chain of being? That also produces hierarchy, right? And things that we would see in the worldview. But that's based on a dualistic worldview of there being a spiritual as well as a physical order of things. I just think this is so interesting. So now we have evolution being an inference, which is exactly correct. And especially the basic premise that all life came from a single-celled organism. That's Darwin's great idea, right? Whether we're talking about birds, bees, bats, humans, trees, slugs, it all came from a single-celled organism. And part of why evolutionists believe that's a strong inference is we can see the similarity and connectivity of all life. All these carbon-based life forms are, if you guys are familiar with the different proteins, I believe there's over 100 different proteins that we're aware of, but life is made up of 4. And if you saw that movie Gattaca, they're using the GATC, those proteins. And it's just different combinations in different ways coupled with the human genome that produces this vast array of life. And so one inference could be, if all life we see on the planet shares this trait, there must be some common origin from which all things came. That's a very reasonable inference. But how about this inference? We see similarity in all life because they have the same creator. And just like you can recognize your favorite band, even when a new song comes on the radio, you're like, hey, that's my guys. And because you're familiar with their style, their approach, their aesthetics. And a theist would simply see creation pointing. We infer that there is a creator from the creation. Both are using inference, but both inferences are steeped, one in the view that only the physical exist, and the other that there's both a spiritual and a physical. Both are legitimate presuppositions, but they do not stand once you put them in different worldviews. I got to finish this off. We're running out of time.
It happens to be a very powerful inference, supported not just by the tree of life, but by anatomy, by behavior, by other homologies, biochemistry, embryology, and so forth. Descent with modification is the one explanation that makes sense of a huge, huge amount of biology. And that is why it is a very, very powerful and a very solid explanation. Now, I'm not going to talk anymore about the methods of science. Let me talk a little bit about the content of science. And here I want to steal a very good diagram from my friend Jim Treffel, who is a physicist who does some very good writing for the public on science. He talks about the content of science forming three concentric circles. In the middle, the core, as it were, the first concentric circle, consists of the core ideas of science. These are the ideas that are well tested, that are well accepted. We've tested them so much, we really have a lot of confidence in them. It may not be true that the planets go around the sun, but it's worked really well for a long time. It's not an observation. Nobody has sat out in space and watched the planets.
That's why we got the flat Earth revival movement.
Heliocentrism is an inference.
It's an inference.
Just like common ancestry. Most of the really good ideas in science are inferences, by the way. So things like heliocentrism, things like evolution, plate tectonics.
Okay, now I'm not trying to be bad, but this is the bait and switch I'm talking about. I think it was right at right at 57 minutes. She says most of the best ideas of science in that core are inferences, evolution or common descent being two of those inferences. But then she goes right on to say, because these have been heavily tested. That's not that scientific method. That's done through observation, hypothesis, testing, etc. Inferences, you can't test. You're inferring them on things you think you already know. And I just think this is an important distinction. And to me, this is that sleight of hand, trying to now imply that Darwinian evolution is a well-tested, verified theory. Now, there are lots of things that verify it, and we'll get into that next class. But I don't like the inference scientific method switch up.
Those are core ideas of science. They can change, but in general, we have a lot of confidence in them because they've held up for so long. Around the core ideas of science is the scientific frontier. Now, the scientists at Stanford and other universities and in biotech firms and engineering firms around the country, they are the ones making the discoveries. They are the ones working, where they work is on the frontier of science. And some of these frontier ideas that they are testing and evaluating will go into the core. Many of them, most of them will not. You have a whole lot more ideas than you have good ideas, unfortunately. And it takes a lot to really establish one of these core ideas of science. Jim Treffel also talks about the fringe as being the ideas that are really out there that professional scientists really aren't spending any time on. And this is the realm of pseudoscience, creation science, and so forth.
Flat earthers, all those guys.
Occasionally a fringe idea.
Telekinesis,
idea,
ghost hunters.
Becomes a core idea.
They're all in the
Not
fringe.
Very often. There's a reason why fringe ideas are fringe. It's because they don't help us understand nature, and that's why scientists don't spend any time on it. When we look at evolution, the big idea of evolution is, of course, this idea of common descent, common ancestry. We also look at two other components of evolution in evolutionary biology: the mechanisms or factors of effecting, bringing about evolution, natural selection being the most important one, but there's other factors.
Okay, that's probably good for now. I just think that's such a great way to explain it. I love having Dr. Scott explaining kind of like that naturalist materialist piece and perspective. She's obviously very intelligent, very articulate. She knows what she's talking about. She's a good debater. I like the way she's pointing these different conflicts out. And I don't see her as hostile per se to a theistic worldview or a pantheistic worldview. She's simply saying, as a scientist, we need to stay in our lane. And they would recommend to other groups, whether you're the Pope or Ken Ham, stay in your lane too. You can talk about God and love Jesus all you want, or if you're a Buddhist or a Hare Krishna, that's fine. Just don't impose your mystical religious beliefs into the classroom, into the science departments. But if science is being taught only from one particular worldview, you can see how it could skew our understanding. And so I love this idea of being able to move throughout the perspectives and spectrums. And how would a theist look at this? How would a pantheist look at this? How would a naturalist look at this? So I hope that was a good opening for you. And I got just a couple minutes left. If anyone has any questions or comments, well, let me first respond to my questions. Why can you not use the scientific method in the study of origins?
Because there can't
Anybody?
be control environment. Hello? Can
Right.
you
And you can even go back a step. Yeah, I can hear you. You said because there's no way to do a controlled experiment, and that is correct. I mean, we can do little versions. For example, they have been breeding tens of thousands of generations of fruit flies because they have I think like a 3-day lifespan or something crazy like that. And you just get all these wild mutations from multi-legged, multi-winged, no wings, deformed, grotesque fruit flies. But in all these tens of thousands of generations, they're still fruit flies. So we can see variation, we can see mutation, but this idea of mutation adding genetic material, that seems a lot more problematic. Okay. Could it have happened that way? It's possible. Not likely. Same thing. If you believe God special created the world, you have to take that on faith. You have to take that on this idea that the scriptures are true. You're inferring from what you can see to what you can't see. And the scriptures are very clear on that. By faith, we believe that the worlds were framed by him, not by evidence, not by sight. Although in Romans, there's this declaration that by the physical world, by the works of his hands, we know that there is a God. And in the context of this, we would say we infer that there is a God, in using more scientific language. Now, my second question was, can science be used for the study of origins? Not the scientific method, but science itself. Anybody?
I think it can because archaeologists, they excavate stuff that relates to the days before the Bible was made or before the Old Testament. And in order to see how old that is or where it came from, doesn't it need to be tested in somehow, some way?
Very good. And that's such a great comment. And I think that will be an important segue for our next talk. I think I'm going to talk about some of the big issues. We'll talk about adaptation, evolution, and I think we should spend some time talking about dating techniques. Like, why do scientists think the cosmos is almost 14 billion years old and the Earth over 4 billion years old? The biblical account has it either all being created together in that in the beginning verse, or it has the sun, moon, and stars showing up 4 days after Earth. So at least in those Genesis days, and we talked about all the different things that can mean. So for our next talk, let's do that. We'll talk about, I think maybe we'll focus on some of the morphology, especially human evolution, I think would be interesting. And so I'll present like a naturalist materialist perspective on the data, and then we'll do like a counterpoint with like a young earth creationist perspective. And so we'll finish out the course looking at individual topics like human evolution, horse evolution, dating techniques, and we'll do like a point counterpoint from a naturalist and a theistic. Especially I'm going to take a young earth creationist view since it's more kind of extreme. There are old earth creationists and all that, and we can have that discussion too if you want. But any other comments before I log off for today?
No, sir.
Okay, I'm going to stop this video, but I'll linger a little bit if you guys want to talk.